Okay, so week one is just a basic introduction and welcome to the subject. Well, we cover a lot of the administrative matters and things of that nature. So ground rules are pretty basic. I'm working on the assumptions that you're adults and you're here to learn. And make of that what you will. So we go through the subject outline briefly, but then we start off by talking about the subject. What's the subject about? What's the purpose of it? What's my involvement all about and whatnot. So to start off with, I like to talk about organisational change and the value of organisational improvement as a backdrop for what we do in the subject. So if we look at businesses and managers making decisions, we often see sometimes things go well, sometimes things don't go well. So when I joined the subject, the focus was very much on just completely free-form entrepreneurship. So just come up with a new product or service idea and off you go. And that's similar to how change is approached in organisations. By default, I suppose would be the way to say it. People come up with an idea and seems plausible, and off we go. Let's do it. But there is value, and what we're going to focus on in the subject is the value of a disciplined approach to change. So that's by applying some of the basic principles from the improvement literature. In particular, one of the major changes we've made since I joined was the introduction of a whole first assignment for clearly defining and articulating a problem. Because yes, you don't need to define a problem to pursue change, but you're essentially taking a lot of risk, unnecessary risk by doing that. And if we look at brand new businesses which start, and so entrepreneurship, what is successful? Well, what's successful is when you have an original and innovative product or service that addresses a need for people. Now, the exception would be, I think, entertainment, because it's just this very generic, broad problem of just boredom, and you can address boredom in any number of ways. But for other than entertainment, generally speaking, you look at successful startups. It's those that actually address an actual need rather than an imaginary one. That's not to say that they can't get a lot of attention and initial interest, but it's the scenario sort of goes like, well, people will see what you have to offer and they'll say, oh, well, isn't that wonderful? That's so creative. That's so interesting. Oh, wow. Okay, what's for lunch? People can simultaneously see something as being very creative and interesting, but they just have no need for it. So the need for a product or service is closely related to how it addresses an actual problem that the potential customer has. Clearly defining and understanding a problem is at the root of a disciplined approach to change. So that's what we do. CBP is also a crash course into quite a number of business-related concepts for engineering and IT students as the audience. So we try to introduce a variety of different topics, which you may not be interested in immediately. So if you're technically oriented, and so as someone who programmed for 8-9 years, I can certainly relate to the mindset that, well, this doesn't seem that important, but it is important, and I'll tell you why. As a programmer and I was very very technical in my work, so C++, C, later on a bit of Python. But over the various jobs I had to learn a lot about structural engineering. I had to learn about the administration of patients in hospitals. I had to learn about advertising and ad placement. I had to learn about a lot about finance, specifically commodities, futures markets, and things of that nature. So even though, yes, I was a programmer, I had to learn about all these different things. There are a very small number, and to be honest, I couldn't really say I've ever seen anyone working in one, but I guess they are out there. There some very small number of purely IT jobs where what you're doing is just IT and you have no other things to consider. And for the vast majority of you, yes, you are going to be working in technical roles, but you have to understand the business or the organization that you're working for and what they're all about. You certainly aren't going to go far if you approach the interview by for your job by saying, well, yeah, that's all well and good, but I'm just interested in the technical stuff. Good luck with that. If you think that's going to work, probably not. My advice would be not to take that approach. You're unlikely to succeed, in my opinion. Because we are introducing so many different topics, what we like to do is to make the class interactive. So from week 2 through to week 7, what we have is an interactive lectures process. And what that means is every prior week you will receive 2 readings, so they'll be available on UTS Online, or if you're just listening to this on YouTube, then you can find those documents some other way. But for our students, they're available online, and you'll have a number of questions listed the prior week, so you can prepare answers for them. You have a week to prepare, and then come into the class and present an answer. And so for each question there'll be one student drawn from, or one student's group selected, and you decide amongst yourselves who presents the answer, and that's 5 marks of the assessment, and everyone has one shot at that throughout the session. And once you present that answer, up 1 or 2 marks for additional commentary, discussion from anyone else in the class, and so we have up 2, sometimes 3 additional students volunteering to provide additional discussion there, and that's capped at 5 marks. So, and once that's done, if anything obvious has been missed, then I'll go provide some additional information. So that's how that process works. And here we'd have a bit of a pause here and just talk about, do people understand this process? But it's pretty straightforward. And the final reminder is that it is, while it's open book, you can't just use an electronic device and read off that. That's not acceptable. Now, a lot of people in the class are being IT oriented. You're all excited about the future of AI. I would pose the question to you all, and I'm not really sure what the term is, but there must be some term for it. When you have someone search something on, say, Google, so they have a question, they search for it on Google, and then the human is just reading thoughtlessly, mindlessly reading the answer off Google. So it's it somehow seems to relate to artificial intelligence, but just inverted in an odd way. So I'm not sure if there is a term for that, but yes, we don't want to see that. If there is value in what you have to offer to a system as a human being, it's going to have to be more than just reading something. I mean, certainly we can just have a text-to-voice software do that if that's what we were interested in, which we're obviously not. Okay, so then we look at the prior skills and knowledge slide. So there's a few things that a few links we have available. This is a little PDF up on the UTS Online. And these are, you'd say, they're soft prerequisites for what we're doing in the subject. The idea is these are all things which are important to the subject. Now, they are soft prerequisites, so these are things which will help you to do well in the subject. And obviously, we're more than happy to help. If you struggle with any of these areas, but they're not part of the classes. So any of these areas, if you feel that you're not very strong in these areas, well, then that's the onus is on you to go learn about these, improve your skill in these, or ask us if you have any questions, because they're important, but then they're just out of scope for what we do in the subject. So for the prior knowledge question of things, we used to have an actual paper questionnaire, but what I do now is simply just ask in the class for a show of hands, how many people have experience doing some academic writing and referencing things of that nature. So a few things to point out for the prior skills and knowledge. For the academic writing, especially for the first assignment when you're presenting evidence of the problem that you're intending to solve in the subsequent assignments, it's important that you go beyond simply just citing a source and, well, here's the conclusion that the authors came up with. You will need to explain how their conclusions provide evidence for your problem. So the most obvious way of doing that is to explain what was the methodology. So how did they reach their conclusion that you're citing? So don't just cite the conclusion, explain the method. So you have to explain you have to explain the research that was done and how that's evidence. So that's important. And likewise, there is some need for understanding statistical concepts. We don't really get into the heavy calculations, but with statistics and with the critical thinking and logic as well, I guess the analogy I like to use is the pitfall analogy. And it's interesting because we often say, oh well, these are pitfalls, but I think the way the analogy is used is actually kind of a bit strange. So if you're walking along the road and you fall into a hole and into a pit, you immediately recognize, hey, I've fallen into a hole, I have to climb out before I can continue walking. However, with logical fallacies, with biases, or with various things in statistics, it's very easy to make a mistake, so fall into the pit. However, it's not always immediately obvious to you that you have fallen into a pit. In fact, I keep seeing lots of examples where people have fallen into a pit. It's a mental pit, it's a metaphorical pit, and they don't realize that they have, and so they sort of just stand up and keep walking, even though they're still in the hole. So the physical analogy just breaks down at that point, because you're just walking, with your head sticking out of the road, as the case may be, and the rest of your body is just magically moving through the road. You don't even realize you're buried in the road. What do you call that? Just carrying a mistake. Easy to do in maths, and it's very easy to do in other areas of thought. So spending a bit of time to understand what these pitfalls are is important if you're going to avoid them. So I would encourage everyone to do a bit of that. As far as the statistical side of things, there's some great information in one of the books we used, The Improvement Guide by Langley et al. It's a great introduction to organisational improvement concepts as a single volume introduction. I think it's a really good book. I would recommend people buy it and just read it cover to cover if you want to. You can just rely on the couple of chapters that we have available online, but there's value in reading the whole book. I would recommend it. So we have 3 main assessment items in the subject, which are the 3 assignments, 2 individual and 1 group. The first assignment is the definition of a problem. So you have to define a problem, provide some evidence, and then assignments 2 and 3 is taking that problem and suggesting a solution, as well as coming up with a mock-up or prototype in the third assignment. So we'll talk about those as we get closer to those. So in the first assignment, we tend to be very flexible about what topics students choose. So we say within the theme of sustainable futures. In the past, we've done transport, we've done health and well-being, but now there is or approved alternative, and so we will accept pretty much anything as a topic. The question is, can you formulate it as a problem statement? Is it something that you can provide evidence for? One limitation usually is that it has to be a current existing demonstrable problem, and we'll talk about problem definition. So one thing you can't really fit into the way the assignments are laid out is something like a hypothetical future problem. So we had one student who was very interested in VR and the VR goggles and things like that, and he was interested in, well, what are the health effects of that? Because prolonged use of anything could have some health effects, but it's a hypothetical future problem because it's brand new technology, so there's no evidence that has been collected for you to cite. So I suggested to the student that, hey, maybe that's a honours project if you're interested in doing a bit of research into that, but it's just not something you're going to find much in terms of data for the assignment here. And there's a bit of speculation about the future there as well. It's not something which people use very heavily yet. So to say, well, it's going to have health effects, that's speculation. That's not an actual current problem. It's something that might need to, yes, maybe that is a concern. It's just not something which fits into the format of how the assignments are laid out. So it has to be a current demonstrable problem. Okay, so to look at a few of the tasks in the assignment that might need a bit of explanation. So task 3 is background research, where you're looking at some of the contextual information. So this is prior to specifying the exact problem you're working on, but just some more of that context of some area where there are various problems that you're interested in. Then task 4 is the causal loop diagram. We'll look at these models in the second week, how you go about doing those. Task 5, and there'll be more information in the assignment template as to some of the subsections there, but you have to come up with a clear demonstrable problem statement, as well as defining the improvement criteria by which you're going to measure progress towards that problem being addressed. So some operational definitions will be needed for that as well. Okay, so task 6, now this follows logically from task 5. So once you have identified some of the key variables in relation to the problem that you're working on, well, then you want to find some data. And that will depend on the sort of problem that you've defined. For the most part, this is where you're really getting into some of the academic literature and looking at some of the studies and research and evidence that has been collected and presenting that, as well as, again, to reiterate, presenting some of the explanation as to how those studies have been carried out. So don't just say so-and-so did a study and they came up with 27%. Well, what does that mean? How did they collect the data? What was the sample? What was the method that they used, etc.? And this gets particularly difficult if you're making complex causal claims in your problem statement. I would advise you against it. I mean, so if you're looking at causal evidence, then either you have to learn about experimental design, which it's a great thing to learn, but that could take a little bit of time. Or if you're looking at some what they call observational studies. I did read Paul Rosenbaum's book on observational studies, very great book. But once you start to get to some of the statistics in that, it's just it's tough. It's tough to explain how some of those calculations work. So keep that in mind with how you define your problems. And then process diagrams. So we will talk about process modeling in week 3. Okay, so as far as marks go, satisfactory work is classified as a pass rather than 100%. If you're looking for higher marks, you will have to put in some effort beyond simply just filling in the text box in the template and saying, "Hey, I submitted an answer. It's sort of okay." The expectations are a bit higher than that, so keep that in mind. First week activity that we have before the class starts is relating closely to role models. So here in the class we would actually have a bit of an interactive discussion as to who some of the students consider to be their personal role models. Okay, so getting into the content around problem definitions, we look at the model for improvement as per the improvement guide, the book which I'm again suggesting people do read cover to cover if they really want to get the full experience. I really do like the way that the authors frame the improvement journey as 3 questions. I think if you look at some of the alternatives such as Six Sigma's DMAIC model, DMAIC's M stands for measurement. What the authors here propose is a question: how will we know if a change is an improvement? Now this implies measurement. In 99% of cases you will pursue measurement as your approach. However, there are situations where things aren't easily measurable, and so your evaluation will be a little bit more subjective. And yes, in the first instance you should look for how you can measure things, but there are situations where you will rely on a more subjective evaluation. I really like that use of the wording there. So the first question: what are we trying to accomplish? Now in CBP we ask students to have a concrete problem statement rather than the slightly softer first question here, which is what are we trying to accomplish? The implication is the same. You could say that they're both just different sides of the same coin, that you have a problem and then, well, what are we trying to accomplish? Well, we're trying to address that problem as much as we can. The reason we prefer to focus on the concrete problem definition in CBP is that with a softer question like this, it's easy to accidentally focus on something which is something which you might want to accomplish but isn't necessarily addressing a real problem. And again, that comes back to the initial discussion of, well, organisational change. If we're trying to achieve, say, entertainment, then maybe there's no concrete problem that we need to be solving if the outcome that we want to have is just entertainment. But in most other circumstances, we actually want to address something which can be framed as a problem. If it can't be framed as a problem, you really have to give some thought as to why not. So that's why we focus the assignments around a concrete problem definition rather than just a slightly broader question, what are we trying to accomplish? The risk with using that in the assignment would be that we end up with a lot of really vague and impractical ideas. I think we've had my favourite example, which I keep repeating, is the flying bicycles. We've had students propose that for transportation, and well, if it answers that question, we're trying to accomplish flying bicycles. You could say it's creative. It's something which people might get excited about. But why do we need them? What problem do they really solve? The implicit question there is, what are other solutions to that problem that might be a lot easier to implement? Because we're just injecting a solution at that point. But if the problem is something like, congestion on footpaths or something of that nature, well, there might be more practical solutions than saying, let's just make bicycles fly. Okay, and then later on in the subject, we will look at assignments 2 and 3, where we look at the actual solution. So what's important here is that we are keeping these very separate for good reason. If you start thinking about the solution now, then it becomes very difficult to have an honest discussion about the problem. Because, if the solution is a foregone conclusion, then there's no discussion about the problem. The problem must be true because we've already decided on the solution. Unfortunately, a lot of what gets labelled as improvement efforts in organisations aren't really improvement efforts, they're just implementation projects dressed up as improvement. If you have a solution in mind, that's a project at that point. It's no longer an improvement initiative. I mean, that's a shift which happens between question 2 and question 3 in this flow chart here. So defining the problem, so we are looking at answering those first 2 questions. The second question about measurement, we're going to look in a bit more detail in a subsequent week. So what's important in a problem definition? Okay, so it has to be clear and specific. Firstly, for your own sake, so you're clear on what you're trying to do. But also, especially in organisations, you are communicating this with others. So having something which is clear and easy to understand is obviously going to help communication. So for scope, you want to be clear of what you are proposing to address and what you're not proposing to address. So this might be geographic scope would be the really obvious example. What subcategory of the problem are you trying to address, which by extension excludes other things which you're not claiming to be trying to address. So you're directing your efforts to something. So improvement criteria, so this is an operational definition of how you will measure progress towards the goal as indicated by the problem. So what are the variables and how will you, what is your method of measurement, as well as assumptions and constraints. So once you start looking at measurement and data collection very quickly, you'll start to see limitations, and because the ideal data that you would like to have is not what's necessarily going to be available. Okay, so the problem should be easy to understand, but it also needs to be testable and falsifiable. Can we prove that it is indeed a problem? And this does matter. We don't want to be chasing problems which are speculation. our opinion that, well, this seems like a problem. How do we know that it's a real problem? So testing and falsifying the claim. This comes back to this disciplined approach to change. You want to be really sure that something is a problem if you're going to direct resources towards it. As an organisation, as an individual, if you're going to direct time, effort, money at something, you want to be really sure that it's an actual, real thing, not something that we've just imagined. So that's important. So a simple example we keep coming back to throughout the semester is Sydney trains, and this particular problem statement: during the morning or evening rush hours, Sydney trains are overly crowded. So the overly crowded part is the core problem statement, and all the yellow text there is the scope. So we have a geographic scope here, so we know we're talking about Sydney trains, not trains in an arbitrary other location. And we also know the time frame. So when in the day this problem occurs, if you take the train at 11 o'clock at night, probably not much of a crowding problem then. Okay, so problems and symptoms. So this is another thing where we open things up to the class for discussion. Another reason to really spend a bit of time thinking about the problem and trying to understand it before jumping to thinking about solutions is that we want to be clear on whether we're addressing the problem or whether we are addressing a symptom instead. In the case of the trains, we might be seeing a lot of complaints about the crowding. Well, yes, we might focus our efforts on addressing the complaints. That doesn't make the underlying problem go away. It depends on the context from which you are perceiving the problem. If you are in the complaints department, you simply look at how to reduce the number of complaints rather than addressing the root cause. That's not to say that that's the correct response for the organisation. In this case, it's very clear. If you address the crowding problem, the complaints will reduce as a consequence of that. But sometimes it's not that obvious. So hence the value of a disciplined approach to change, where you take the time to understand the problem before you jump to a solution. Because yes, if we immediately accept that the complaints are the problem, well, that's going to conjure up lots of ideas about how we deal with the complaints. And this is something in consulting I've seen unfortunately happen a lot, is once you go down that path of really exploring one of these solutions, no one really wants to answer the question of, well, what is the real problem that we're addressing here? I'll talk about some of those examples later. But it's a serious cognitive challenge when dealing with change and the difference between improvement and just implementation is it is a very linear, a directional process. Once you shift from the improvement thinking and understanding the problem and specifying what we're trying to address towards an actual idea for a solution and a project, that's a one-way street in most cases. It's very difficult to pull ourselves from solution thinking back to trying to understand the problem and looking at other areas for intervention, because we've already... It's difficult. It's very rare for that step back. I rarely see that in organisations. Typically, it's commitment to a solution escalates, and over time it becomes more and more difficult to even discuss the question of whether we're addressing the right thing or not. Once people are already designing the solution, no one wants to even talk about the question of whether we're addressing the right problems. It's too late at that point. So hence the need to really think about this at the scoping stage. The area of sustainable futures we use, because it is such a broad area with lots of sub-areas, and each of these has a myriad of separate individual problems within them, we suggest that you choose a topic that you're passionate about. It doesn't have to be in sustainable futures, it could be a different problem area. That's one way of making the assignments a lot easier for you mentally, because yes, if you are interested in a topic, you will pursue that with more enthusiasm than if we had assigned you a topic. However, what we found is a lot of students struggle with the problem definition. So what we have done is we've introduced a vetting process for the topics. Now, the reason for this is we don't want you to get to be halfway through your second assignment and then get feedback for the first assignment when it's marked saying, oh, your problem definition is poorly formulated. We've had the students really, naturally and reasonably be upset by that, because you think you're doing well, and then you realise, at an unfortunate moment that, oh, hang on, there's something seriously wrong with how I'm approaching this. So we want to get that feedback to students immediately, so that's a bit of extra work for me, but I'd rather see good assignments, so I'm happy to do that. So here's what the process looks like. We have an online form for you to paste in your problem statement, and I have a look at that, give you some feedback on it, color code it. When you look at that, you will then decide, well, am I happy with the problem statement I have, and you can proceed with the assignment, or you can get this feedback a few times. So for the first 2 weeks of the subject, we have this available to help you out, essentially. We clearly state in the assignment template that the problem definition should include a problem statement. And one thing which I still don't understand is why we see a lot of people write a question. Why? How? So many questions are written instead of statements. As I pointed out earlier, the problem statement needs to be demonstrable, and it needs to be testable and falsifiable. It's a claim. You have to provide evidence for it. Now, if you have a question, how would you provide evidence for a question? A question isn't a claim. Yes, sometimes in how we talk and converse, we will use a question to indirectly say something. So we might use a rhetorical question, for example. That's not really acceptable for a problem definition. You have to be very, very specific, and a rhetorical question is not something you can provide evidence for. It's not a claim. So your problem statement has to be a claim. So as time progresses with this, the statements become, obviously there's always room for improvement with a problem definition, but the statements do become much more specific, much clearer. That's the purpose of having this feedback cycle at the start of the subject. So at this point of the class, we have a bit of a break and some ice breaking. It's also a good time to answer any individual questions, so we sort of take 15 minutes off to do this. Okay, so the final topic for the class, as far as content goes, in the first week is business processes. So first we start by looking at definitions, which I'm not terribly concerned with having one universal definition, because there are so many. Everyone has a different definition of business processes, and I think what's more important is to see that there is a variety of perspectives, and they are all useful under different circumstances. So we can look at a process as a transformative activity which transforms inputs into outputs, and as value-adding steps of the organisation. So one view of organisations is as a collection of functional processes, and each of these could be carried out by one person if you're talking about a very small business, or entire teams of people if you're looking at a larger organisation. So it's one method by which organisations define their structure. We will look at organisational structure as a separate topic later on, but processes as a determinant of structure is one perspective there. So processes and sub-processes, pretty obvious. Any activity could be subdivided into more finely defined activities, so that applies to business processes. If you look at, say, customer billing, printing and mailing invoices would be one activity within that broader process, but then that could be subdivided even further. Okay, and then for this slide I found the most complicated looking biochemistry process model I could find. So this was, yes, I don't quite understand what this is about, but that's not necessarily the point. It's a nice slide for discussion. What's the difference between a business process and a natural process? I posed this as a question to the students. So there's a few answers. So there's the concept of value, and if you're looking at a business process, you're interested in how it creates value. You will be looking at, you'd be interested in how efficient it is, and all of these ideas if it's a business process, whereas for a natural process, these sorts of value judgments don't really apply. We would talk about how individuals are the key component. Here we're looking at molecules. In a business process, we typically, and especially when modelling, we're very often concerned with who's involved, what are the roles involved in different activities of a business process, and the modelling very often is shaped around that. Not always. Sometimes in business processes we're interested in how long things take. So in which case we'll be looking at delays and time of the different activities rather than necessarily who's involved. I suppose there's still a value in modelling people in that scenario, because you still every handover from one person to another would potentially introduce a delay. So there's still, so even in that scenario, you still want to look at modelling people. You often would be interested in modelling communication between people as well. And finally, we can also look at the question of, well, is a business process emergent or is it an artificial thing? And this is where the discussion gets interesting. We get into this discussion a little bit more in week 3, but the word process needs to be considered in conjunction with the word procedure. The word process refers to something which is emergent, something which occurs, as is evident by this particular diagram. There is no one giving the instructions for how this is to be done. This just occurs naturally. And likewise, a lot of what happens in organisation is simply people will go and do the job that they do. There is a very absurd argument that a process is a broader set of business activities and a procedure is the detailed business activities. Now, I say it's absurd because just the language itself shows that that's a flawed idea. We wouldn't have two separate words, process and procedure, if it was just a matter of scale, we'd use a prefix. We'd just say a sub-process or a detailed process or some other prefix. The fact that we use two different words is because there are two different phenomena. The process is the emergent business activity, which, as a simple example, look at your corner store. There is a customer service process occurring there, but in all likelihood, not a single step of that is documented anywhere. So it's a process without a given procedure. Of course, especially for larger retailers, there will be procedures for how that customer service process should be carried out. It's important to note the distinction, and we'll talk about this a bit more in week 3, but if you have the procedure defined in conjunction with the people who do the job, so if you consult them, you work with them to figure out, well, how should this work be done, and you design a good procedure that the people are consulted on, and they agree with the methods being used because that's how they do their job, and you incorporate that into a procedure document. Well, this will be a procedure which you can then have the team refer to as a guide, and they'll generally be on board with it, and the process which you see will be very closely reflecting of that written procedure. But if you look at the other extreme where, and this, unfortunately, this does happen all too often, you will have someone not involved in the work at all writing the procedure, not consulting the people who do the work, but simply declaring, well, this is how the work is to be done, and they'll document it, present it to the team and say, well, from tomorrow, this is how you're going to do the job. Now, what can often happen here is the procedure doesn't take into account the reality of the job, because there will be exceptions and there will be considerations which simply did not make it into the document. So now the workers have a very difficult situation. Do they follow the procedure exactly and basically completely fail at doing their job because the procedure does not actually describe the work that needs to be done? Or do they do their best in getting the job done, which means departing from the procedure? However that occurs, there is going to be a difference between the documented procedure and the actual process that occurs. And there is a great potential for confusion, of course. So I will talk about that a bit more in, I think, week 3 or 4. And finally, journey maps. So for a process model, we typically look at activities, but we might look at who's involved, but we don't really collect much in terms of qualitative information about how they feel about the different steps in that process. The journey map is a tool for capturing some of those qualitative experiences along a timeline, as shown here. This format is appropriate if you're addressing the needs of a customer. So if you're looking at specifically a customer-facing business process, the customer's experience is very relevant to capture there. But if you're looking at some other problem or some natural process where there is something which we consider to be a problem, then attaching value judgments doesn't really help. So if you're looking at a biochemical process, like in the previous slide, and maybe somewhere within that process there is the risk of a cancer occurring or something like that, well, someone's opinion on it doesn't really help in terms of the information. So how you capture that sort of subjective information is going to depend on what problem you're trying to address. Okay, and for next week, so we have 2 readings which will be available on UTS Online, or for anyone else tuning in, you can find these on your own. And we have 10 questions, except it's actually 15. So for questions 3 to 7, the asterisk means that one pod will have a student present the direct answer, and another pod will present a counter argument to the first group. So those are the questions more suitable for a bit of a debate. Answering some of these questions will help us to understand systems, which is the topic we're going to be looking at next week. Some of those, so 8 through to 10, very much relate to the syntax of the causal loop diagrams, and you have causal loop diagrams in the first assignment and the third assignment. So that's useful from a technical point of view, but the rest is very important from understanding systems. Okay, so that's it for week 1.